And after shady geopolitical dealings with the White House, Google has now moved on to lobbying governments across Europe, and that's according to a report by U.S.-based watchdog. 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗱𝗃 investigates.
A transparency group has looked at the revolving door between tech giant Google and governments in Europe and the U.S. It found that the door has been spinning a lot in the past decade. So, Google has been actively hiring government employees, and governments have been hiring Google staff. With me now is Daniel Stevens of the Campaign for Accountability group that tracked those moves. Thank you for coming, sir.
Thanks for having me on.
Do you see a strategy here, and if yes, toward what end?
I see a strategy in that Google is seeking to obtain influence from government at all levels. They maximizing their power and influence to sort of leverage their connections with regulators and officials to obtain the policy goals that they would like to see. The FTC agreed not to file a lawsuit against Google in its antitrust battle with them. That is one thing that Google gained from regulators.
WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange wrote a whole book about the close connection between the tech giant and Washington. Here's what he said just earlier this week.
Google is heavily integrated with Washington power on a personal level and on a business level. Google, which has increasing control over the distribution channels, is intensely allying itself with US exceptionalism.
Former State Department official Jared Cohen went to work for Google, and while at Google, consulted with the State Department on creating an app that would track defections within the Syrian government in order to prompt more defections. That was 4 years ago. 3 months ago, the Pentagon announced that Google's former CEO, Eric Schmidt, would head a new Pentagon advisory board aimed at bringing Silicon Valley innovation and best practices to the U.S. military. These are just a few examples of that revolving door.
Google has a huge influence in all of our lives, our policies, and everything else. And we should be aware of what role government regulators and authorities are playing in handing Google sort of that oversized role in the rest of our lives.
Thank you, Daniel Stevens.
Thanks for having me.
In Washington, I'm 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗃𝗃𝗃, RT.
Google's privacy issues and lawsuits are well documented, but less reported, however, are the company's ties to the NSA and its connections to the CIA. Now, as recently as 1 month ago, leaked emails from Stratfor revealed that Google is getting White House and State Department support and air cover. In reality, they are doing things the CIA cannot do. The US government can then disavow knowledge, and Google is left holding the bag. Press TV reported that among the Stratfor emails that WikiLeaks received were some exposing Google as not just an intelligence contractor for the CIA and Department of Defense, but foreign governments as well. Text within the highly sensitive cables outlines criminal and even terrorist activities on the part of Google, including the planning of insurgency operations. Google has helped plan military operations against Syria and has been directly involved working with Arab states and Turkey to plan destabilization of Iran. In 2010, Wired reported about the development of technology that scours tens and thousands of websites, blogs, and Twitter accounts to find the relationships between people, organizations, actions, and incidents now both present and still to come. The technology created by Recorded Future, a company that both Google and the CIA have invested in, goes beyond search by looking at the invisible links between documents that talk about the same or related entities and events.
Eric Schmidt is Google's CEO. If you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
I know that Warren Buffett was involved because he was part of the cult that I was involved with. He was involved with trafficking of children and killing children and having sex with children. And that's why this has been basically kept under wraps.
Kissinger is a famous pedophile, as is Gordon Brown and the Bushes, and I could go on and on. There's millions of them. And they'll have a field day with children once they are able to take over.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has urged people not to use Google, saying it's a CIA project. He was speaking at a media forum in St. Petersburg. He told the audience that Google collects users' personal data and then sends it to the Savers base in the US.
US and Israeli spy agencies have already been accused of using social networking sites to gather personal information worldwide. Last year, Google came under scrutiny for its alleged ties to the CIA and US National Security Agency. Many believe the Google founders would never have gotten the publicity and wealth without such connections. Facebook is another site being widely used by the CIA and Mossad for destabilization operations. According to a Department of Homeland Security report, Facebook has replaced almost every CIA information gathering program since it was launched in 2004. Last year, one of the founders of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, who's considered by many alternative American media to be linked to the CIA, was awarded a prestigious medal for his work with the agency. Zuckerberg called the site the single most powerful tool for population control ever created. It doesn't take much forethought to realize that there are countless privacy pitfalls. Identity thieves and government spies in America and abroad find it easy to collect information from a near-endless stream of personal bits indiscriminately posted and stored. The public controversies that have erupted with Facebook and Google are only the first catches in the rapidly growing cyber networking scene. Users may take immediate action by disabling some properties of their accounts, but the question of whether they can evade the American-controlled and monitored cyberspace still remains.
In 2004, Google bought this company called 𝗘𝗆. And this software that they have is what we now know today as Google Earth. I'm sure you've used it yourself. Now, 𝗘𝗆 was part owned by the CIA and the NGA. Happens to be the sister agency to the NSA, and everybody knows what they're all up to. 𝗘𝗆 also had one major client base. Lo and behold, the US military and intelligence agencies. Okay, so that's important to note. And then I want to cover this. In-Q-Tel, a venture capital fund run by the CIA on behalf of the military and intelligence community, made a strategic investment in 𝗘𝗆 a month before the US launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. There's a lot I've just gone over in the short period of time. There's more to that. Let's get into this right away. This is a press release. In-Q-Tel announces strategic investment in 𝗘𝗆. Back in 2003, In-Q-Tel, a private non-profit venture fund funded by the CIA, today announces strategic investment in 𝗘𝗆, a pioneer of interactive 3D Earth visualization. So it goes on to talk about what it's all about, but this is the official press release for that. Okay? Moving on. Former CIA officer Robert Steele said that the CIA's Office of Research and Development had at one point provided funding for Google. According to its literature, ORD had a charter to push beyond the state-of-the-art, developing and applying technologies and equipment more advanced than anything commercially available, including communications, sensors, semiconductors, high-speed computing, artificial intelligence, image recognition, and database management. That's what Google is. Okay? There's more about that, the connections there. All right, let's just move on very quickly. You may have heard this information before. Now, the investment arms of the CIA and Google are both backing a company that monitors the web in real time, says it uses the information to predict the future. So the CIA and Google once again working together. They are, as far as I'm concerned, one in the same. Realize that we pay taxes, we're giving them to this government. The government then uses that against us. I mean, think about this. They created Google specifically to spy on us. Google is a creation of the government, doing so purposely to track, categorize, database every single piece of information that you have. That when you're walking down the street, they're following you. When you're going through any sort of camera, the microphone that I'm speaking into right now, the microphone on my cell phone that's currently off is still recording me, the microphone on my computer, the microphone, the camera on my computer looking at me in the face and recording every piece of information, bringing that back to the powers that be, and they will use it against me. They will use it against you.
This episode is about two things. Number one, Google, one of the most recognizable brands today. We know them from the operating system on our phones, to their smart home devices, to Google Search, Google Maps and Gmail, and even YouTube itself. They're an organization that's so prevalent that they're almost invisible. And the other thing that this episode is about is the CIA, the same organization that overthrows foreign governments and spies on leaders and citizens. From human rights violations to drug trafficking, the CIA has always been shrouded in mystery and controversy. So what does Google have to do with the CIA? Well, many people may not realize this, but the CIA was directly involved in the foundation of Google. Google co-founder Sergey Brin even reported to representatives of the US intelligence community on his progress. Not only this, but the application that became Google Earth originally had CIA investment. Generally, this is a concerning relationship, but in this episode, we're going to take a deeper look. First of all, let's take a brief look at the CIA.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
After World War II, the United States would face the Soviets in a battle for world supremacy. The invention of the atomic bomb meant that no weapons could be fired in this war, so other methods had to be used. Over the next 40 years, a period known as the Cold War would begin. No shooting, just subversive tactics. In the mid-1940s, the President of the United States, inspired by the efforts of the UK's MI6 during World War II, would sign the National Security Act, which formed the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. And right away, the CIA would get to work interfering in international politics. In an effort to stave off communist influence on the global stage, the CIA would interfere with the 1948 Italian elections. They would overthrow the governments of Iran and Guatemala in 1954, Indonesia in 1957, and Brazil in 1964. The CIA also conducted some rather questionable projects on their own people. Project MKUltra, for example, was the CIA's mind control program using, quote, chemical, biological, and radiological methods. Many of the studies within MKUltra focused on the administration of LSD to prisoners, drug addicts, mental patients, along with government agents and the general public, all without their consent.
Documents pried loose in 1979 showed that through a front organization, the Central Intelligence Agency funded what was called the MKUltra project.
The CIA wanted to understand more about brainwashing. It had money and it was ready to fund experiments, breaking down the mind with repeated electric shocks and drugs, including massive doses of LSD.
These experiments were done without the informed consent of the patients.
Lawyer Alan Stein took up some of the rejected cases. The government's paid a number of settlements since. Many of the payments come with non-disclosure agreements.
They're trying to do it quietly.
It's not fair. I mean, I feel blessed that I was able to get this far for my parents. I really do. That's what gives me justice. I'm just grateful to be able to do it, and I hope I just hope that you can hear me up there, because it might bring you peace. It might bring you both peace.
Ultimately, the CIA's goal of using LSD as a mind-altering weapon against the Soviet Union and other enemies never reached fruition. But by the time the project was disbanded in the mid-1960s, hundreds of people were unknowingly drugged and observed. I found this last one pretty entertaining. One of the most embarrassing failures of the CIA was the attempted assassination of Cuba's Fidel Castro.
So, in interviews, Fidel Castro used to say, if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic sport, I would win the gold medal. Reportedly, more than 600 attempts over his 50 years in power. Now, many of the failed plots were concocted by the CIA.
The CIA tried infecting Castro's scuba gear with tuberculosis, planting exploding seashells at his favorite diving site, slipping him a poisoned fountain pen. They even tried poisoning and slipping a bomb into one of his cigars. All of these attempts were a failure. It was a gigantic waste of time and money, and Fidel Castro was Cuba's dictator for another 49 years, stepping down in 2008 only due to failing health. This is all to say, the CIA may seem formidable, but when it comes down to it, they're not always perfect. With the Soviet Union gone, the CIA's actions today may be less well known, but their influence on the world certainly hasn't gone away. And that brings us to their relationship with Google. In 1994, two PhD students, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, began working on their automated web crawling and page ranking application as part of their research project. They had bet on making the exploding internet easy to access, and it paid off enormously. Sergey Brin's part of the Stanford research was funded by the NSA and CIA. Brin would often report progress to non-Stanford individuals, one of whom was Dr. Rick Steinheiser. Steinheiser represented the CIA's Office for Research and Development to oversee their research funding in a joint CIA-NSA program. It wasn't uncommon at the time for research projects to be funded by the intelligence community. Government intelligence agencies had set up programs and often seed-funded projects. Roughly $3 to $4 million of funding flowed through the intelligence community programs into universities. And while both Google and the intelligence community deny that the CIA directly funded the start of Google, it's evident that the intelligence community's research funding helped not only Google, but Silicon Valley as a whole. There are many ways this relationship is built and preserved. One of the biggest is perhaps the Highlands Forum. There's a good chance that you've never heard of this forum, but it connects the wider Department of Defense and the intelligence community to the tech startups. This keeps the military and the intelligence community at the cutting edge of tech. Many executives on the Highland Forum hold positions in the CIA, NSA, and many other agencies. Movements from these agencies into Silicon Valley is common. For example, in 2012, the Highlands co-chair, who also worked at DARPA, left the agency to accept a senior executive position at Google. In an email thread made public, Sergey Brin discussed information sharing for the purposes of national security with the head of the NSA. In 1999, at the peak of the dot-com boom, the CIA launched In-Q-Tel, a Silicon Valley venture capital fund. Its mission was to invest in startups that aligned with intelligence agencies' needs. In 2003, the CIA, through In-Q-Tel, would invest in 𝗘𝗆𝗄. 𝗘𝗆𝗄 was a startup that built 3D global mapping software. One of its first uses was to support US troops during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the campaign to overthrow Saddam Hussein. The next year, Google bought 𝗘𝗆𝗄, whose team now included CIA personnel. Google would soon turn 𝗘𝗆𝗄 into the basis for Google Earth. Only a year after the purchase, the director responsible for initially investing in Keyhole at the CIA investing firm In-Q-Tel moved to take a position at Google. During this period, Google would win contracts for different search applications for the NSA and CIA. It's understandable that Google has a relationship with the CIA and many other government agencies. In fact, most tech giants do. At the start of this year, with a looming US election, some of the biggest names such as Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, and Google have had meetings with the FBI, Homeland Security, and the Office of the Director of National Security. Little is known about these meetings, apart from the theme of how tech giants can ensure security for the 2020 elections. Google, for example, has implemented an advanced protection program. This program offers Google's highest protection level to high-risk targets such as journalists, activists, politicians, and business leaders. It effectively makes these accounts less susceptible to hacking risks such as phishing and malware attacks. But perhaps the greatest demonstration of the company's integration into the intelligence community is Google Federal. Google Federal was launched in 2006, and its purpose is to serve federal contracts. At a certain point, this branch of Google had so many former NSA staff that they became known as the NSA West. At its very launch, Google Federal went on a hiring spree, hiring managers and salespeople from the Army, Air Force, CIA, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin. It added to its lobbying prowess by assembling a team of Democratic and Republican operatives. The strength of the relationship between Google and the intelligence community was graphically highlighted in 2010. At this time, Google came under attack from what was believed to be Chinese government hackers. The NSA came to Google's aid. The two organizations struck up a deal, an exchange of information. According to journalists, quote, Google agreed to provide information about traffic on its networks in exchange for the intelligence from the NSA about what it knew of foreign hackers. Google Jigsaw is a division dedicated to combating global threats such as extremism, censorship, and disinformation, but this division has had its missteps. In 2012, as the Syrian civil war was escalating, the intelligence community was pushing for a change of government. In 2016, leaked emails revealed that Google's Jigsaw department brainstormed ways that it could push Bashar al-Assad from power. Among these ideas was a tool that visually mapped and tracked officials who broke allegiance to Assad's government. 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗄, head of Google Jigsaw, planned to show this data on TV networks such as Al Jazeera within Syria. The purpose of this was to serve as propaganda to give confidence to the opposition of Assad. This opposition was, of course, the side that the intelligence community wanted to win. According to Fred Burton, a former intelligence agent at the security branch of the State Department, quote, Google is getting White House and State Department support and air cover. In reality, they are doing things the CIA cannot do. More recently, Google created a tool to track if users are at high risk of radicalization based upon their internet usage. The tool redirects them to government websites focused on persuading them off their ideas. It seems now, more than ever, Google and other tech giants are blurring the line between corporate and government intelligence. Google's entry into the market makes financial sense. By 2019, the federal government was spending $90 billion a year on information technology. It's a huge market, and Google seems to want to maintain a strong presence. The world in which the CIA and the intelligence community operates is a distant cry from reality and what most people are aware of. Likely, we will never know the full extent of their operations or the events that the CIA had an impact on. From helping overthrow governments to spying on the public, many controversies follow this organization. We didn't even touch on drug trafficking operations during wartime in Asia, Watergate, or the recruitment of former Nazis.
I've been a journalist for about 25 years, and I was educated to lie, to betray, and not to tell the truth to the public. It is not right what I have done in the past, to manipulate people, to make propaganda, and it is not right what my colleagues do and have done in the past, because they are bribed to betray the people not only in Germany, all over Europe. We have betrayed in the past our readers. I was supported by the Central Intelligence Agency, by the CIA. Why? Because I should be pro-American. I'm fed up with it. I don't want to do it anymore. Most of the journalists you see in foreign countries, they claim to be journalists, and they might be journalists, European or American journalists, but many of them, like me in the past, are so-called non-official cover. That's what the Americans call that. I have been a non-official cover. Non-official cover means what? It means you too work for an intelligence agency. You help them if they want you to help them, but they will never, when you are locked, or when they find out that you are not only a journalist but a spy too, they will never say, "Oh, this was one of our guys." They will not know you. That means non-official cover. So I have helped them in several situations, and I feel ashamed for that too now. Like I feel ashamed that I have worked for a very recommended newspaper like the Frankfurter Allgemeine, because I was bribed by billionaires, I was bribed by the Americans not to report exactly the truth. Germany is still a kind of a colony of the United States. You see that in many points, like the majority of the Germans don't want to have nukes in our country, but we still have American nukes. So we are still a kind of a colony of the Americans. And being a colony, it is very easy to approach young journalists through what is very important here is transatlantic organizations. All journalists from really respected and recommended big German newspapers, magazines, radio stations, TV stations, they are all members or guests of those big transatlantic organizations. And there, in these transatlantic organizations, you are approached to be pro-American, and there is nobody coming to you and saying, "Well, we are the Central Intelligence Agency, would you like to work for us?" No, this is not the case how it happens. What they do, these transatlantic organizations, is they invite you for seeing the United States. They pay for that, they pay all your expenses and everything. So you are bribed, you get more and more corrupt, because they make you good contacts. You won't know that those good contacts are, let's say, non-official covers, or officially people working for Central Intelligence Agency or other American agencies. So you make friends. You think they are friends, and you cooperate with them. They ask you, "Well, could you do me this favor? Could you do me that favor?" And so your brain more and more is brainwashed through these guys. I think it is especially the case with British journalists, because they have a much closer relationship. It is especially the case with Israelis, of course with French journalists for a part, not that big as with German or with British journalists. It is the case for Australian journalists, for journalists from New Zealand, from Taiwan, well, there is many countries in the Arab world, like Jordan, for example, like Oman, the Sultanate of Oman. There is many countries where this happens, where you find people to claim they are respected journalists, but if you look behind them, you'll find they are puppets on a string of the Central Intelligence Agency. Sometimes the intelligence agencies, they come to your office and want you to write an article. Do you really think that this is journalism? Intelligence agencies writing articles? This is not the way journalism should work, that intelligence agencies, that they decide what is printed and what not. If I say no, I give you an example from a very good example if you say no. Well, we have a rescue unit in Germany with helicopters for traffic accidents. It's called, they call themselves the Yellow Angels. There was one guy who didn't want to cooperate. He was a pilot of the helicopter service of the Yellow Angels in Germany. This guy said no to the Foreign Intelligence Service Bundesnachrichtendienst when they approached him and wanted him as a non-official cover to work for the German Foreign Intelligence Agency, under just to pretend to be somebody from the Yellow Angels. So what happened was that he lost his job. And the court in Germany, the judge decided that they were right, because such a guy could not be trusted. He was kicked off his job because he didn't cooperate with the Foreign Intelligence Service. So I knew what would happen if I would not cooperate with intelligence services.